Welcome aboard. Tonight, we set sail into the still waters of the past, gently drifting through a time when the sea, once a symbol of freedom and commerce, became a vessel of dread. As your head sinks into the pillow and the day's noise begins to fade, let yourself imagine the creak of old timbers, the slap of salt water against hull, and the low groan of ropes pulled taut by the wind. This is not the story of grand battles or legendary it is the quieter, slower tale of life aboard a ship no one wanted to see approaching. A vessel marked by fear, a ship quarantined at sea, a plague ship, through candlelit decks and silent holds, will explore the rhythms of daily life, the quiet rituals of survival, and the strange stillness that descends when the world turns its gaze away. What did it smell like? How did it feel to breathe stale air, day after day, watching the shoreline that you could not reach? And later, we'll journey deeper into the lives of the captains who bore this grim burden, the port officials who turned them away, and the strange cargo they carried besides the sick. We'll uncover secrets and symbols from maritime plague history, and contrast it all with the elegance of the elite, far removed from the sea's sorrow. So, pull the covers close, and steady your breath with the tide. Let go of the present, and drift with us through history. Imagine waking not to the sound of birds or street vendors, but to the low drone of waves, licking the hull repeating rhythmic, like breath. The planks above your head groan softly as someone walks across them. The light that filters in is thin and filtered, dappled through slats and sails, and always tinged with a damp, briny hue. This is the morning routine aboard a plague ship, a day like any other, and yet unlike any day on land. For the crew, life settled into a slow and narrow pattern. Quarantine, after all, meant waiting. Not hours, but weeks, in some cases 40 days or more. The very word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, and so the men waited. They swept the decks with seawater, a ritual more about habit than hygiene. Salt scrubbed against worn wood, darkening the grain with each pass. They coiled ropes that would not be used, patched sails that would not be raised, and prepared meals with whatever provisions had not yet spoiled. There was no fresh bread, of course, no leafy greens. Instead, a diet of hardtack so dry it might break a tooth, and salted meats that had long since lost their flavor. Water, stored in barrels, grew stale and thick with algae. Many drank weak beer instead, or watered-down wine when it was available, hoping the alcohol would stave off illness. Time was marked not by clocks but by chores, rotations, and the changing light. Morning fog gave way to the heavy stillness of noon, and then afternoon brought heat. The ship became a floating oven, its lower decks a trap for warm air and the stifling scent of sickness and sweat. The men spoke in hushed tones. Some played cards, others carved bits of bone or wood into small trinkets, charms, perhaps, or simply distractions. These tiny acts of creation helped pass the long hours, and gave hands something to do besides worry. For those in the infirmary, if it could be called, that conditions were quieter still. The sick were separated, laid out in hammocks or cots. There were no doctors aboard most plague ships. Perhaps a surgeon, trained more in amputation than illness. More often, care came from fellow sailors, clumsy, improvised, and always distant. The soundscape of the ship was eerie. The ocean lapped and murmured. Wood creaked. Chains rattled faintly. But the laughter and shouting of a healthy crew, that was gone. In its place, coughing, soft prayers, and the heavy quiet of waiting. Letters could not be sent, and even if they could, who would receive a message from a plague ship? These vessels flew warning flags bright yellow, or sometimes blackhand, were kept far from port. Smaller boats might bring supplies and drop them overboard or tie them to a rope, but no one dared come aboard. Sometimes the ship was not sick, yet but suspected. A single sailor had died of fever, and now the entire crew was condemned to drift offshore, close enough to see the city lights at night, but forever denied its comforts. At night, the stars seemed impossibly close, with no land nearby, and no city smoke to cloud the skies. The constellations glowed sharp and cold above the masts. Men would lie on their backs atop the deck, staring upward, counting the stars like the days, hoping they would run out of one before the other. Sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it was heavy and dreamless. Bodies worn from heat, poor food, and worry gave in at last. Hammocks swayed with the ship's slow rhythm. Rats scurried along ropes. Somewhere wood softly popped as the hull shifted against the current. And so another day passed. Nothing changed, and everything changed. The sea kept its secrets, the land kept its distance, and aboard the plague ship life went on, slowly, quietly, and always uncertainly. The sea has always tested its sailors, but few trials matched the silent weight borne by the captain of a plague ship, to stand at the helm, not in motion, but in exile, to command a vessel feared by all. This was the peculiar burden of quarantine. The man charged with steering a ship that could not dock, issuing orders that no one wished to carry out, and shielding his men from panic, despair, and disease alike. Imagine yourself now not as a sailor, but as the captain. Perhaps your name is Paolo, a merchant captain out of Genoa, or maybe Marseille. You've sailed these routes for years, ferrying cloth, spices, glass beads, and now something you cannot see. It might have begun before you even left port. A laborer fell ill while loading cargo. You thought little of it. Then, mid-journey, a crewman began coughing. Feverish, delirious. A few days later dead. You noted it in the logbook with a heavy hand and a racing mind. There was protocol. Of course, the republics and kingdoms of the Mediterranean knew disease could come by sea. Long before modern medicine, cities like Venice and Dubrovnik imposed strict maritime quarantine laws. A ship with signs of pestilence was not to dock until the appointed days had passed 40, if there was real suspicion. 21 sometimes, for lesser illnesses. But your ship, it bore a price. So now you anchor offshore, just within sight of the harbour. Your cargo, your letters of passage all mean nothing now. The yellow flag is hoisted. You are a captain without a port. Each day you must maintain order, morale, cleanliness. But how? The ship is already growing restless. Rations dwindle, tempers flare. A man is found trying to sneak into the galley in the dead of night, hoping to ration ahead for himself. You punish him not harshly, but visibly. You cannot allow disorder. And then the questions begin. Why can't we go ashore? I feel fine. What if the port changes its mind? What if we all get sick anyway? You answer calmly. You offer reassurances even when you harbor doubts. You are captain, not physician. Your charts tell you how to find land, not how to navigate a disease. In your cabin, you write letters to your superiors, to the port authorities, to the trading company, letters that will never be delivered, or if they are, they will be read with gloves and burned afterward. Your handwriting, your very paper, is now suspect. At night, you pace the deck. The sea is still. The stars continue their march, but your ship feels no closer to salvation. You remember the old legends, ships found adrift, all hands gone, a single lantern still burning in the forecastle. You wonder if that will be your fate. A floating ghost, feared and avoided, drifting until the winds decide your end, and yet you persevere. You start inspecting the men yourself, quietly noting who is pale, who sleeps more than usual, who hasn't eaten. You instruct the cook to boil water before serving. You reassign duties to break up cabin fever. You hold fast to routine. Morning deck scrubbing, noon inventory, evening lookout. You write in your logbook daily. The script grows tighter, more compressed, as ink and paper dwindle. You describe the weather, the morale. You do not record your own fear, but it creeps between the lines. In the distance, life goes on. Small fishing boats slip across the horizon. Birds wheel above the shore. You envy them. They know nothing of quarantine. They live beyond borders and eventually, a signal comes from the porter boat, small and manned by only 2 rowers, approaches. They wear masks. They do not speak. They toss a sealed letter wrapped in oilcloth onto your deck and row away. You read it in silence. You are to remain another 20 days. Another crew has fallen ill in the harbor. The authorities have become more cautious. Your fate, for now, is sealed. You sigh, fold the letter, return to your post, and resume your vigil. This is the burden of a plague captain. Not war, not mutiny, but waiting, watching, commanding men in stillness, not in storm, leading not toward land, but through time, and always, always, the quiet question, will anyone remember your name, or only the flag you flew? The open sea has always invited myth. Its vastness, its silence, its indifference, these give rise to stories. And when the ships of plague floated just offshore, visible but untouchable, they became more than vessels. They became symbols to the port cities that watched them from their towers. These ships seemed almost spectral, like omens, anchored in the bay, not merely carriers of disease, but bearers of judgment, of mystery, and sometimes of something more. Let us drift now into the quieter layers of this history, into the rituals, beliefs, and forgotten cargo of the plague ship. A cargo that was not always listed in the manifest. Some ships, especially those from Eastern Mediterranean routes, carried silks, incense, and apothecary goods. These items, soft, aromatic, strange to the European nose, were treated with suspicion. How could a scent, a spice, a scroll, possibly carry illness? And yet, they did not understand microbes. So fear filled in the gaps. Authorities would order the fumigation of goods, sometimes by vinegar, sometimes by smoke. Crates of fabric would be unsealed and held over smoldering herbs. Barrels of oil cracked open and examined by torchlight. Papyrus, parchment, even the wooden beams of the ship were believed to absorb disease and might be burned upon arrival. Certain captains knew this, and they brought with them not just trade goods, but talismans. Amulets were hidden among the ropes. Small, carved bones, tucked into the seams of sails. Iron nails, blackened by fire, nailed beneath the helm. These were not items for trade but offerings. Protections, quiet pleas to the sea. One commonly found item aboard ships of this era was the plague charm. A scrap of paper or cloth, inscribed with a sacred verse, folded 7 times, and tied to the wrist or tucked under the tongue. These were meant to ward off the unseen force, the evil wind that brought sickness across water. Even the ships themselves bore signs. The yellow flag, raised high, was both warning and confession. Some vessels added painted symbols to their hull crosses, eyes, or the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, signifying both protection and the cycle of death and rebirth. The crew believed in these things. In quiet ways, a man might refuse to sleep in a particular hammock if the previous occupant had taken ill there. A coin dropped into the sea during morning watch might be offered, not lost. A prayer murmured not to God, but to the sea itself, asking it to pass over the ship that night. And what of the rats? Much later, science would point to rats and fleas as plague's true courier. But in the 17th century, they were simply unsettling companions. Most ships had them hidden below deck, darting among cargo. When the rats died suddenly, sailors whispered of evil near. When they grew bold and numerous, it was taken as a sign. The ship was no longer theirs. There were stories passed port to port of ghost ships found adrift, of lanterns still swinging in the of journals with final entries written in trembling hands. No crew, no sign of struggle, just silence. Some believed these ships had been cursed, not just infected, that something had boarded along the way not from land, but from the deep, perhaps an ancient god, long forgotten, or a punishment for daring to cross forbidden waters. Superstition reached the very design of quarantine. The Lazarettas Island stations where sick ships were sometimes sent were often built like fortresses. Thick walls, high towers, one in Venice still stands. Lazaretto. Archaeologists have found mass graves there, but also religious medallions, charms, and carved stones with strange markings. The fear of plague was not just medical, it was deeply spiritual. Even when the ship reached land after long isolation, after fumigation and inspection, its crew might not be welcomed. Some would be held longer, interrogated, their belongings burned. Others would find themselves marked, not physically, but socially. Tainted, avoided. Their names entered into ledgers that whispered suspicion. And so, long after the voyage had ended, the cargo lingered. Not just silks or oils, but memory, reputation, fear. A ship that had once flown a plague flag would never be forgotten, nor would its captain, nor its strange and silent vigil at sea. Tonight, we remember those stories not because they were loud or heroic, but because they were quiet. Because, in their quietness, they echo. Because history is not only what was carried in barrels and boxes, but what was hidden in pockets, in glances, in prayers, while the plague ships waited silently on the horizon, bobbing just beyond reach. Life in the port cities continued warily, cautiously, but undeniably with more comfort. It is here, in the contrast between sea and shore, that the social divide becomes most clear. Imagine yourself now in a coastal town, perhaps Dubrovnik, Venice, or Marseille in the late 17th century. Morning arrives not with the roll of a deck or the scent of stale water, but with the ringing of bells and the clatter of market stalls being set. The breeze that floats in through your window carries salt. Yes, but also lavender from the hills and smoke from bakeries firing their first loaves. From a shaded terrace overlooking the harbour, you can just make out the distant silhouettes of the anchored ships. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to sense their presence. The yellow flags, fluttering listlessly in the breeze, are like punctuation marks on the skyliner, quiet reminder that danger drifts just beyond. The elite of the port cities lived high above the docks, both literally and socially. Their stone villas, adorned with carved lintels and draped in climbing vines, sat atop the hills, or clustered around plazas protected by gates and guards. These citizens had the luxury of distance. They read about the quarantines in ledgers. They issued decrees from behind thick doors. Their experience of the plague was filtered seen through the eyes of scribes, servants, and city magistrates. The wealthy did not board the plague ships. They did not wait in hammocks or swelter in the hold. Instead, they hosted small gatherings outdoors when possible, in manicured courtyards or under canopies of ivy. Musicians played softly. Glasses clinked, News was exchanged in low voices, and always the sea remained in the background, beautiful and vaguely threatening, like a painting with dark corners. Even within the city walls, there were divisions. Merchants and shopkeepers might worry about their goods, their shipments delayed or destroyed by quarantine. Dock workers feared exposure. Servants were often the first to fall ill, moving between homes and the streets, carrying messages, and sometimes more. To shield themselves, the upper classes clung to rituals and remedies. A bowl of vinegar might be placed by the window to purify the air. Fresh herbs were tied in bundles and hung from doorframes. Some burned juniper. Others carried perfumed pouches tied to their belts or tucked beneath layers of clothing. Doctors, when called, wore their strange beaked masks filled with aromatic substances meant to cleanse the air before it reached the lungs. These figures became a symbol in themselves, not just healers, but walking reminders of fear and frailty. They did their rounds and returned to their quarters, where they removed their garments with the ritual of a priest disrobing after Mass. And yet, despite all this care, fear lingered in every corner, because the sea was not still. It brought change, goods and people and stories, and sometimes illness, and always blame. Whispers crept through the salons. Was it the foreign ship from the Levant, or the French galley that arrived too late to be inspected? Who allowed it to dock? Who paid the fee to bypass the quarantine station? And in the taverns and alleys, the murmurs were different. The rich will be spared. They don't wait 40 days like we do. Their letters don't get burned. These unspoken divides were made more visible during times of crisis. The plague ship was a mirror showing not just disease, but disparity. Yet even in privilege, there was no true immunity. A servant might carry the illness into the house. A letter, improperly cleaned, might infect the hands that opened it. A ship, once believed safe, might deliver more than fabric and spices. And when the illness did reach upward into the homes of the elite, it struck with a strange quietness. Curtains were drawn, notices posted, entire homes shuttered, and silence followed. Still, even then, they were not sent out to sea. The plague ship remained the exile of the sailor. The merchant crew, the lower ranks, the elite were isolated within their walls. But on land, always on land, this divide of who waits afloat and who waits ashore lingered long after the sickness had passed, in memories, in policies, in stories told to children decades later, and tonight, as we remember those drifting vessels and the velvet-draped rooms that ignored them, we recognize the dual truth of history, that suffering may be shared, but comfort is not always evenly distributed. The ships returned, eventually, or they didn't. But the cities, they always endured, brick by brick, rule by rule, while out beyond the bay, a flag fluttered in the salt wind, unseen and slowly forgotten. And so we leave the harbor behind. The ships, once heavy with silence and sickness, have faded into the mist. The men who paced their decks, who stared out at a world just beyond reach, now rest in nameless graves, or in the pages of forgotten ledgers. The captains who wrote dutifully in their logbooks, the merchants whose goods were never claimed, the rats that scattered below deck all gone. Yet the rhythm of their waiting lingers. The way they scrubbed the planks each morning, the way they watched the shoreline without hope or anger, but with the dull persistence of those who must endure. That rhythm, like the tide, echoes still. You may never sail on such a vessel. You may never wait at anchor, counting the stars. But even now, in the still hours of the night, there is something in their story that drifts through time. A reminder that there were once men who knew what it meant to be close, but not allowed to come closer. To see land, but not step on it, to carry unseen danger and bear it in silence. History does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on ships that do not dock, in days that pass slowly, under skies that never change. It happens in the soft breath of sailors asleep in hammocks, in the rustle of wind through empty rigging, in the faint echo of a cough behind a wooden door. Tonight, you've walked the decks of one such vessel. You've peered into the captain's log, handled the talismans and trinkets of uncertain meaning, and looked ashore from the eyes of those who were not welcomed home. You've glimpsed how the privileged waited, and how others drifted, unseen, and now your journey ends. Let the waves fade from your mind, let the wind grow still, let the distant lights of the shore blur and vanish, replaced by the quiet dark of sleep. You are no longer at sea, you are home, and the ship has finally docked. Good night, traveler, and thank you for drifting through history. Welcome, traveler. Tonight, we slip backward not through jungle or across sea, but along the winding rivers of memory, into the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, where cities rose from mud brick, and knowledge was pressed gently, yet permanently, into slabs of clay. This is not the tale of kings or conquerors, not tonight. Instead, we'll walk the narrow path of those who sat beside reed-filled baskets and steaming ink pots, whose fingers were stained with the earth they wrote on, and whose thoughts, sometimes thousands, in a day were not their own. You've likely heard of cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script. Ancient, noble, enduring, but behind those little marks were real hands, tired, cramping, ink-blotched hands, a scribe's hands. Tonight, we'll follow them from the dusty benches of palace archives to the hallowed halls of temple astronomy, from the charred ruins of a forgotten library to the feasting courts where scribes were both envied and ignored. We'll discover why the written word was both a burden and a blessing, and why, despite their titles and training, it often sucked to be a scribe. So adjust your blanket, breathe deeply, and let yourself drift to a time of reeds, tablets, and tired eyes, in the land where history was first written down. Imagine yourself now, not as a pharaoh, not as a priest, but as a professional listener, a recorder, a transcriber of other people's thoughts. The stylus is your sword, your battlefield, the clay. It is early, the first cool hour before the Mesopotamian sun begins to bake the rooftops. The workshop smells of damp earth, drying straw, and a faint trace of oil. Rows of clay, tablets some soft and pliable, others hardening in the shadar, laid out on wooden racks like loaves of bread awaiting judgment. You take your place on the low bench, knees bent, stylus in hand. The reed has been cut just so angled to make crisp impressions. Each wedge you press must be precise. Slant, depth, spacing, it matters. Everything matters. The first task of the morning. Dictation. A palace official enters. He doesn't sit, he paces, rattling off a list of orders from the king. The allotment of sheep for festival sacrifices, adjustments to barley rations, an edict concerning the theft of irrigation water. His voice is flat, fast, and entirely unbothered by the fact that you are trying to immortalize his words in mud. You press each symbol carefully, pausing only when he doth, which is never. You cannot interrupt him. You cannot ask him to repeat. You simply carve and hope. Your stylus slips. A mark is crooked. You curse under your breath. It's ruined. This tablet half-filled must be discarded. Another lump of clay is fetched. Start again. The anxiety never leaves you, because here errors have weight. A misspelling might mean 10 oxen go to the wrong village. A dropped symbol could offend the gods. A cracked tablet? That's worse. That's destruction of record. That's your fault. Outside, the city pulses. Merchants open stalls. Children chase goats. The ziggurat looms in the distance. Its bricks catching the sun like a golden stairway to the sky. But you don't see it. You are here, hunched over, carving a dispute about how many jars of beer were owed to the temple priests last week. By midday, your hands ache, not from writing once but from writing over and over again. Some documents must be copied 3, even 4 times. Originals, duplicates, temple versions, royal copies, each one exact. The stylus, though simple, is relentless. It digs into your palm. Clay cakes under your fingernails. Your back stiffens, and still more come. A merchant with an inventory, a priest with a dream, he insists, must be recorded. A tax record, corrected for the 5th time because a grain delivery arrived late and caused a cascade of errors. Afternoon brings the sun's full weight. The workshop grows hotter. The clay dries faster. Mistakes become more permanent. You wrap wet cloth around the tablets to buy time, but the cloth dries too. Everything is drying, your patience included. Sometimes you wonder about your training, years of schooling, reciting signs over and over, memorizing the signs for ox, for debt, for rain, all for this, the daily grind of bureaucratic immortality. Still, there are moments, a finished tablet, perfectly shaped, its symbols crisp and clean. You hold it up. For a moment, it glows golden in the light. You created this. It will last centuries, maybe longer. Then your supervisor tells you it's in the wrong script variant. Northern dialect. Not acceptable here. Back to the clay pile. Evening comes slowly. The air cools. The shadows stretch. The day's last light creeps across your workspace as you carve the closing symbols of the final document. A receipt for 10 baskets of dates delivered to the palace kitchens. You place it carefully on the drying rack. Then you rinse your hands in a shallow bowl of water, cold and cloudy with clay. You stretch. You close your eyes. And tomorrow, at dawn, you'll do it all again. Let the night settle now. Let the sky stretch overhead, dark and wide, pricked with stars so sharp they almost hum. In ancient Babylon, the heavens were not just beautiful, they were sacred. They were dead, and above all, they were watched. The temple rooftops served as observatories, and atop one of them perhaps, the great ziggurat, believed by some to be the Tower of Babel itself alone, priest-scribe squinted into the dusk, not with wonder, but with duty. His name is lost to time, but let's call him Nabudina, a man of rank, robed in fine wool, with a stylus tucked behind one ear and a tablet balanced delicately in his palm. His task, to track the gods as they moved across the night sky, because in Mesopotamia, stars were gods, or at least their servants, and their positions foretold the fate of kings and crops alike. But this evening Nabudina is troubled. The stars are not where he needs them to be. The king has requested an omen, a favorable one. A new campaign is planned. War again. And a good omen, well-timed, carefully worded, would stir the army, reassure the court, and preserve the priest's position. But the skies are silent. Worse than silent, they hint at delay. Venus lingers too low. Mars burns too brightly. This combination, traditionally, would counsel caution. So Nabudina chooses not to record what he sees. He records what he needs. On a smooth, wet tablet, he inscribes the favorable pattern from months earlier, altering the date, adjusting the coordinates, reshaping the narrative. The gods, according to his new version, are in full support. The king may march, the tablet is delivered by hand, sealed with the temple's mark, and for a time it works. The army moves. The campaign begins. The stars above continue their patient drift, unmoved by the affairs of men. But lies, like clay, dry and harden. A rival priest older, more meticulous sketches the forgery. Perhaps he compares the records. Perhaps he simply remembers. He alerts the temple high council. A formal review is called. The tablet is retrieved, its symbols studied stroke by stroke. Nobodina is summoned. He does not speak at first. Then, slowly, he confesses. Not for profit, not for fame, but to maintain harmony, to protect the kingdom, to keep the temple's influence from waning. His words are calm, his voice steady, but the damage is done. You see, in Babylon, the stars were not metaphors. They were law. To alter their message was not merely deceit, it was sacrilege. The punishment is not death, it's exile. Stripped of his robes, Naboidina is banished from the temple precinct. He leaves behind the ziggurat, the library, the quiet ritual of ink and stars. He fades into the city, just another figure in the crowded markets, muttering forgotten constellations to himself. And the temple, it recovers. It always does. But trust like fired clay once cracked is never the same. Later, priests will cite the incident as a warning. Scribes are trained more harshly. All observations are now dubbed. Tablets must be signed with the name of the observer and the date of sky reading. Astrology becomes more rigid, more mathematical. The stars themselves, of course, remain unchanged. They continue their slow, stately dance, patient and eternal. But down below, on rooftops and benches, the scribes now write more carefully. They remember Naboid. They remember how easy it is to lie to kings, and how quickly the sky will reveal the truth. Let us drift now, not into the daily life of scribes, nor into the rituals of temples, but into silence, into ash, into a library long buried beneath centuries of dust, its knowledge preserved not by careful planning, but by calamity. We are in Nineveh, the once great capital of the Assyrian Empire, a city of walls and gardens, of kings and conquests. But beneath its bustle, deep within the palace of King Ashurbanipal, there was a room of records, a room of tablets. It was no mere archive. It was the library. By the mid-7th century BCE, Ashurbanipal had gathered the writings of the known world. His scribes sent letters across Mesopotamia and beyond, requesting texts, copies, and translations. The result was a vast, organized collection, tens of thousands of clay tablets, sorted by subject, language, and even author. Religion, medicine, mathematics, myths, omens, farming manuals, star charts, recipes, histories. Imagine walking through it. Low stone shelves, neatly stacked tablets labeled with fine script, a quiet hum of styluses scratching, the air cool and dry, and always the subtle, earthy scent of baked clay. Scribes worked daily to copy, preserve, and sometimes edit. Ashurbanipal, an unusually literate king, demanded accuracy but also flattery. In many texts, his name appears tucked into prayers, slipped into myths, inserted where it may never have originally belonged. Then came the fall. In 612 BCE, a coalition of enemies stormed Nineveh. The city burned, palaces collapsed, and the great library, buried under rubble and ash, was forgotten. But the fire unknowingly preserved it. Unlike parchment or scrolls, clay endures. The heat from the destruction baked many of the tablets, harder, turning them from soft records into virtual stone. What was meant to be ephemeral became eternal, and so, over 2,000 years later, archaeologists brushed aside the dust and found stories waiting. Among the tablets was a tale. You may know the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story of gods, grief, and longing. The oldest known heroic narrative in human history, left in a back room beneath the wreckage of empire. Other texts spoke of medicine, poultices of crushed herbs, charms against toothache, ritual phrases to cure fevers caused by the hand of a ghost. Some were bureaucratic, inventories of grain, letters between officials, complaints about lazy workers. One tablet simply lists sheep, line after line. Sheep, a record of livestock now read by scholars centuries later, trying to divine meaning from monotony. But not everything survived. Many tablets were broken, others only partially legible. Whole sections of text's entire endings were lost. The final lines of Gilgamesh, for instance, are debated. Was he content, regretful, triumphant? The last words were etched, but crumbled before anyone could read them aloud again. Even more curious, gaps of silence. We know that texts on magic existed, but some were removed. Some perhaps hidden entirely. Certain myths are preserved only as references, hints of stories that were once common, now lost. Did the scribes choose what to keep? Did they erase what displeased them, or what displeased their king? There's a soft melancholy here, because the library tells us so much. It reveals the intellect and organization of a civilization that thrived, but it also shows what can vanish, what knowledge slips away not in fire, but in forgetting. Even now, there are crates of broken tablets in museum basements, unread, untranslated, waiting for someone to piece them back together. And perhaps, somewhere, there's still a tablet in the earth, undiscovered, covered in soot and silence. A recipe, a confession, a story, waiting. Let us wander now from the dim scriptoria and ruined libraries into the light. The ziggurat rises in the near distance, its stepped terraces catching the warmth of the afternoon sun. Below it, in the shadow of that monumental staircase to the heavens, the city's elite gather not to pray, but to eat, to plan, to count, and to show one another just how comfortable power can be. For all their reverence to the gods, the upper ranks of Mesopotamian society were thoroughly administrative. These were the overseers, the governors, the scribes who had climbed the ladder into management. They managed warehouses, coordinated temple offerings, and oversaw grain allotments. They did not press tablets, they signed them, and every few days they not extravagantly, not in the way kings feasted, with dancers and elephants, but with precision. These were meals meant to sustain the body, certainly, but also to smooth over politics, reinforce alliances, and most importantly, to demonstrate status. Picture a long, low table in an open courtyard, reed mats beneath, clay vessels neatly arranged, cups of beer, somewhat sour but refreshing, flatbread, lentil stew, grilled goat, and most prized of all dates, sticky, rich, and abundant. The elite were obsessed with them. Dates served as both delicacy and currency. They were tracked in temple ledgers, hoarded in storerooms, and gifted as offerings to both gods and guests. The best came from irrigated groves near the river banks, carefully tended and guarded. Some scribes, those promoted to higher ranks, were assigned to manage date storage directly. Their days were filled with counting crates, verifying deliveries, logging moisture levels. A dry crate could start a feud, a miscounted batch, a scandal. it was not uncommon for a well-placed date shipment to curry favor, or, conversely, for a scribe to be demoted after a bad date harvest. It sounds absurd now, but in a world without sugar, dates were the sweet taste of power. And then there were the other dates. Calendar dates. If you think modern bureaucracy is tangled, the temple system in your ore, Lagash, would give any modern office a run for its silver. Meetings were scheduled not by weekday, but by celestial positioning. Reports had to align with market days, moon cycles, and festivals. There were taxes due on the day of the new reed, but only after the barley rites were completed. A delayed rain could shift everything. This created what some scholars have called calendar anxiety, an ever-present stress among elite scribes and managers who had to not only write, but time their documents perfectly. There are tablets, many of them, that survive with corrections etched in the margins, adjusted date formulas, revisions of festival schedules, even angry notes from supervisors. This is not the proper day. Imagine a modern email thread, but inscribed in mud. And yet, despite the tension, the elite knew how to relax. After a successful audit or temple ceremony, there would be music-reed flutes, soft drums and food, shared among equals. For an hour, perhaps two, they would forget the endless scroll of quotas and simply enjoy the quiet rhythm of a well-balanced bowl of lentils and a perfectly ripened date. Some even brought poets, professional reciters, who would sing lullaby-like hymns praising Nabu, god of writing. The words would float gently upward, toward the ziggurat above, and fade into the dusk. But the moment always ended. The next day brought more records, more schedules, more ink. The tablets never stopped arriving. Clay, after all, was cheap. Time was not. And so the bureaucrats of ancient Mesopotamia lived their lives beside the temple, beneath the stars, between two rivers, and always between two deadlines. They feasted, they argued, they counted, and occasionally they sighed and looked toward the low table where the dates were laid out and thought, at least those are still sweet.
And now, as the moon rises over the land between the rivers, we leave the stylus behind. You've carved the commands of kings. You've watched a priest bow to the stars and then bend their meaning. You've walked through halls of ash, picking up pieces of thought fossilized by fire. You've dined among the administrators where sweetness meant more than sugar, and dates were both fruit and fate. In all of this, a thread winds gently, the quiet labor of the scribe. Not the glory of battle or the roar of chariot wheels, but the scratch of reed on clay, the shuffle of tablets, the weary breath of someone copying the same phrase for the third time. What they wrote became the bones of history, the myths, the taxes, the prayers, the laws, but rarely do we think of the hands that wrote them. Hands calloused and cramped, minds racing to keep pace with spoken words, eyes squinting at soft clay and fading light. And now, in this still moment, as your body settles deeper into the bed and your breath follows the rhythm of some ancient tide, consider this. Their work was not meant for us. They did not imagine you, here, thousands of years later, listening quietly in the dark. They wrote for kings, for gods, for auditors, and for tomorrow's cook. But somehow, through ruin and rediscovery, they reach you a thumbprint in clay, a name in the corner, a correction in the margin. It all survived, not by design but by accident. And yet, it survived. So tonight, rest easy knowing that even the most tiresome tasks done with care, with patience, and with rhythm can echo across millennia. You do not need to remember the names. You do not need to recall the dates. Let it all float now. Let it drift, like a tablet forgotten on a shelf, untouched but unbroken. Sleep well, traveler, and thank you for drifting through history.
Tonight, we journey to the islands of the east, through morning mist and rice paddies, past thatched rooftops and distant temple bells, to a place where the rhythm of life was marked not by choice, but by obligation. This is not the Japan of samurai duels or cherry blossom poems. This is the Japan of worn hands, heavy loads, and a silence carved by centuries of deference. This is the life of the peasant. In feudal Japan, Most people were not warriors, or poets, or nobles. They were farmers, laborers, woodcutters, the ones who woke before the sun and slept in the dust. And though their position was called honorable, for theirs was the work that fed the nation, it was also burdened, strictly controlled, and endlessly. Tonight, you'll rise with them. Feel the weight of a thatched roof that leaks in the spring rains. Count the rice bundles stacked to meet quotas, not hunger. Watch the local magistrate pass by, and lower your eyes, as you've always done. And then we'll move forward into the hidden rebellions, the secret songs, the quiet artistry of a people who lived not for glory, but for getting through the next season. So exhale, let your shoulders fall, let the noise of the present fade, and drift with us into the long, quiet struggle beneath the Shogun's sky. Imagine a morning so still, it almost doesn't feel like waking. A light mist clings to the narrow valley. Your home, single room with a packed earth floor and a roof of worn thatch offers little comfort from the damp. Your clothing is coarse, your feet are bare. And already there is work to be done. You are a peasant, a 100-namer. In theory, your family name connects to land. In practice, it connects only to debt. The first task of the day is the field. Always the field. Rice paddies stretch outward, the water cool and still, reflecting the slow movement of clouds. You move with care, mud sucking at your ankles, knees bent low, hands brushing young stalks to inspect for rot or worm. Planting and harvest are not daily events, but maintenance is. Always maintenance. And always the watching, because this is not your land. It belongs to the Lord, or rather, to the warrior class who govern this province on behalf of a daimyo himself under the shogun. You tend it, you live beside it, but every grain you pull from the ground is already spoken for. Tax comes not in coin, but in rice. The system is precise. Officials arrive after the harvest to measure yields, to inspect storage, to collect. You bow. Even if the crop was poor, even if your family goes without, you dare not question the quota. It is recorded on bamboo slips or paper, tied with cord, carried away on horseback. What remains is yours. If anything remains, some seasons, there's enough for porridge. Others, you stretch millet or acorns to make it last. And yet, the rhythm continues. Your tools are simple. A wooden hoe, a woven basket, occasionally a sickle passed down from your father, its edge notched and worn. Iron is expensive. Repairs are done at home, always patched, always temporary. Your family helps. Your wife, if you have one, works beside you. Your children learn early how to carry bundles, how to cut weeds, how to recognize which shoots are strong and which should be pulled. There is no school, no play, there are no luxuries, no sandals unless you make them, no meat unless an animal dies naturally. You eat what you grow or forage. In winter, you dry radishes. In summer, you drink boiled water to avoid sickness. Illness is common. Medicine is rare. And through it all, there are rules. Your clothing must not be too fine. Silk is forbidden. Even cotton, in some eras, is restricted. Your home cannot be built taller than a samurai's. Your hair must be worn plainly. Your weapons, if you have any, must never be seen. You bow to travelers of higher rank even if they are children. You keep your voice low when speaking to officials. You never look a samurai in the eyes. To break these rules is not just dangerous, it's suicidal. Punishments are swift. Beatings, fines, in severe cases, behead. The Lord must be seen as just, Yezi, but also feared. The order of things must not be questioned, and so you endure. You find comfort in the smallest things. A bamboo flute played after dusk, a good year's first radish, a pot of tea, thin and bitter, shared in silence, the laughter of your child chasing frogs by the edge of the paddy. The sky above you stretches endlessly. In summer, it's blistering. In winter, grey and unmoving, but you do not curse it. You respect it. You work under it. You carry its weight, because to be a peasant in feudal Japan is to exist beneath the sky, and beneath the foot of everyone above you. And yet, you rise each morning, because rice must grow, because the taxes will come, because life, no matter how small, must continue. And as the sun sets over your fields, you crouch at the doorway of your home, watching the wind ripple across the water. You do not speak. You have said everything worth saying with your hands. From the outside, a peasant village in feudal Japan appeared, peaceful rows of thatched homes, the steady hum of labor, the faint clatter of pots and sandals, obedient, quiet, endlessly still. But stillness, in history, is rarely the whole story. Beneath the bowing and scraping, under the rituals of deference, there were cracks, and within those cracks, rebellion lived, not loud, not grand, but quiet, calculated, and ever simmering. It never began with banners. It began with a song. In the paddies, while bent over stalks of rice, peasants sang work, songs, simple melodies passed from mouth to mouth. To the overseer, they were harmless rhythm, but the lyrics changed. Lines about crops eaten by rats might not mean rodents, but officials. Mentions of rotten harvests might allude to a corrupt tax collector. It was subtle, coded, but everyone understood. In taverns, or during village festivals, stories were whispered, legends of just bandits, of samurai who turned their backs on their lords to help the poor. Whether they existed or not mattered less than what they offered. A voice for those who had none. Sometimes resistance took the form of sabotage. A warehouse mysteriously burned in the night. A section of canal collapsed just before tax inspection. Tools disappeared. Wagons lost a wheel en route to the collector's storehouse. Always accidents, always explained with bowed heads and regretful tones, but always messages. These weren't grand revolts. Most were never written down. But in times of famine, or after years of relentless taxes, discontent bloomed. Peasant uprisings, ziki, as they were sometimes called, did happen. One village might refuse to pay taxes. Another might barricade the road. And in rare cases, entire provinces erupted. Briefly, in rebellion, the response was swift. Samurai were dispatched. Heads were taken. Families punished. Villages burned. Records erased. But the memory never quite died. Even within the strictest regimes, the people remembered. A grandmother might quietly pass down a tale. In my mother's time, they stood up. Not as a call to arms, but as a comfort, a reminder that dignity lived even in mud. You see, rebellion didn't always mean weapons. Sometimes it meant persistence. A man who hid a few extra bundles of rice under the floorboards. A woman who taught her daughter to read, even when it was forbidden. A child who carved a prayer into a fence post not meant for offerings. Small, invisible acts. Because to survive was, in its own way, defiance. And the officials knew. They patrolled more often, changed quotas unpredictably, shifted punishments. But no law, no decree, no sword could reach every whisper. And when the festivals came, the brief nights of permitted joy, the drums were struck a little louder. The dancers moved a little wilder. The songs, once simple and work-bound, swelled with new verses. Let the rain fall where it pleases. One lyric might say, the roots know which way to grow. That was their truth. Resistance, not in arms, but in roots, in memory, in rhythm, in the quiet knowledge that even under the heaviest boot, the ground still breathes. Let us now turn from the paddies and village lanes to the foot of the temple gate, a towering structure flanked by stone lanterns and worn wooden beams, its red paint faded by centuries of sun and smoke. Within, a bell waits to toll, incense coils burn low, and behind the curtain, robes rustle, monks in quiet motion. But not all monks came to pray. In feudal Japan, temples were more than places of worship. They were record halls, banks, storehouses, and in some regions, quiet centers of authority, where the sword and scroll met. The monk became scribe, and the scribe became something more. Imagine now a monk in his middle years. His robe is plain, dyed a soft brown, his feet are bare. But beneath that humble exterior lies a deep understanding of law, tax policy, and population count. He holds not a rosary, but a ledger. This monk, call him Shon, was tasked with administering temple lands, many of which were leased to peasants. The produce from these fields did not go to a lord or daimyo, but to the temple itself. Yet the rules were no looser. In some places, they were harsher. Shon knew every name in the village, every household, every child old enough to carry a basket of straw. He wrote their names by lamplight. He calculated their share, often by hand, and if a family's yield was short, if the bundles were smaller, or the delivery late, he was the one who came calling. He came without armor, without weapons, but always with paper. And paper, in this age, had power. Yet sometimes, Shon was not alone. Some temples hired guardsai, or warrior monks. Others borrowed men from the local militia. These escorts did not speak much. They stood beside the monk as he read aloud the entries. Then they waited, for rice, for repentance, for compliance. The village elders bowed low. Apologies were made. Bundles were fetched, and if there were none, the home might be marked, the name underlined twice. Next season, they would owe double, or lose their land entirely. But there was irony here. Many of these monks had once been peasants themselves. They had studied hard, memorized sutras, passed through long rites of purification, all to rise above the mud. And now, in overseeing it again, they became mirrors of the lords they once feared. Not all abused their power. Some were gentle. Some forgave a portion of the yield during famine years. Others arranged quiet loans, hiding debts in coded margins of ledgers. But the system remained cold. Temples received offerings and interest. Monks calculated down to the grain. And behind the smell of sandalwood and the echo of bells was the unmistakable weight of math. The sword was not always visible, but it was implied. In one record discovered centuries later, we find a curious entry. Farmer Genjiro, 4 bundles behind, no seed for next season. Wife ill, delayed. The note is underlined, then a symbol beside it in clear. Perhaps a reprimand. Perhaps something else. That family's name vanishes from the records a year later. No story, just silence. This is how enforcement looked for the majority of peasants, not through the sharp arc of a blade, but through ink, through quiet correction, through the monk's slow steps up the village path. And the monk, he would return to the temple, hang his ledger by the wall, kneel before the image of the Buddha, and pray. For what? Forgiveness? Clarity? Or simply the strength to do it all again next season? Because someone had to count, someone had to write it down, and someone always had to be obeyed. Now let us climb the hill, away from the paddies, away from the ledgers and suit. The village shrinks behind you, its roofs, small, its smoke faint as you approach a different kind of life. The home is large, walled with timber and clay, its garden quiet and precisely arranged. A raked path curves gently to the door, and inside waits a man with a sword and clean hands. This is the samurai, not the warrior on a battlefield, not today but the administrator, the man appointed by his lord to oversee this region. His title may Veregita Bugio or simply Tanasama, but his presence means power. He does not grow rice. He does not tan his skin in the sun. Yet it is his crest stamped on the barrels of grain bound for the capital. The peasants bow as he rarely looks down. Inside his home, the tatami floors are fresh. The air smells of pine and old paper. His day begins not with toil, but with tea. His robes, though not overly ornate, are clean and of quality cotton or silk. He keeps a fan near, but not for heat, but as a mark of refinement. He writes poetry, badly, perhaps, but it is copied neatly by his scribe. On certain days he practices with the sword, not in battle, but in kata, formal movements passed down through generations, precision over blood, form over violence, and yet his presence keeps violence near. His retainers are armed, his authority unquestioned. Should a villager defy the tax, steal from a storehouse, or insult his name, punishment may be swift. A public flogging, a shaved head, or, in rare cases, worse. But most of the time, punishment is unnecessary, because fear flows downward, and so does admiration. Some peasants revere him. He is, after all, the ideal, the one protected by the heavens. His ancestors were warriors. His manner is quiet, measured, impossibly distant. In the evening he reads from Chinese classics. He listens to a biwid, slow, sorrowful, plucking, filling the garden with something like thought. He eats a meal served by a retainer's wife. 3 dishes, always warm, always seasoned just so. And far below, in the valley, another meal is taken. Rice, if they're lucky, radish, if not, and silence. Always, the samurai does not think himself cruel. He believes he governs justly. The rules are old. He did not make them. He enforces them as taught. If he rides through the village and a child stares too long, he says nothing. His guards might glare, but he continues forward. It is not his concern. He has a letter to compose, a tea blend to judge, a visitor from another province, arriving next week. The fields, they are being harvested. That is enough. And yet, sometimes, at night, standing by the outer gate of his estate, he hears something on the wind, the faint trace of a song, not one sung in courts or temples, but from the paddies. Low, tired, repetitive. He listens for a moment, then he turns back and closes the gate, and now the path winds home. The fields fade into shadow. The fires in village hearths burn low. In the distance, the last cry of a night bird echoes over water, and even the ziggurat-like steps of the samurai estate fall silent beneath the moon. You have walked today in straw sandals. You've pressed your hands into the flooded soil, bowed beneath the weight of unseen burdens, and stood very still as the sword passed by. And you've seen that history does not always rest with the ones who build castles, write poems, or give commands. Sometimes it rests with the ones who endure. The peasant in feudal Japan lived a life of structure and scarcity, yet even within that narrow frame, they carved out meaning, in whispered songs, in stolen smiles, in rituals so subtle they were almost invisible bundles, tied just so. Prayers said not aloud, but under the breath, glances exchanged when no official was watching. These were not acts of defiance. Not always. More often, they were simply acts of being, of staying, of continuing. Because the rice still had to grow. No matter the tax, no matter the rules, no matter the weather or the war or the shogun's decree. And now, as your breath slows and your body settles into rest, remember this. Beneath every great empire, beneath every banner and creed and title, there were always people like these, quiet, steady, overlooked, and yet they carried the whole thing. Their footsteps may be faint now, lost beneath centuries of conquest and ceremony, but if you listen closely, in the hush between your own breaths, you might still hear them walking the same narrow paths, one season to the next. They are gone now, but the rice still grows, and you may finally sleep. Good night, and thank you for drifting through history. Welcome once again. Tonight, we sail far from the long houses of Norway and the sagas of conquest. Not to war, not to treasure, but to a colder shore where the sky never quite brightens, and the days pass slowly, like ice melting on stone. This is not the Viking life of legends. This is the other one, Greenland, a land of rock and wind, where a small cluster of Norse settlers clung to the coastline for centuries, growing little, herding what they could, and always waiting for a ship that might not return. There were no feasts of gold here, no epic battles, just frozen ground, sour milk, and smoke-heavy turf homes, and somehow they stayed. For generations. Tonight, you'll rise with them, you'll milk the sheep, check for cracks in the boat shelter, and scrape lichen from stone to feed the goats through the lean months. You'll hear no news, see no foreign sails, and go to sleep with the same thought as every night before. Please, let there be firewood tomorrow. And later, we'll drift deeper to the tale of Eric the Red, to the vanishing footprints of a civilization lost to silence, and to those who lived in comparative warmth, far away, telling stories of their frozen kin. So lie still now. Let the frost settle in the corners of your thoughts, and join us in the cold, quiet places where history moved slower than snow. It is morning, but there is no light. The sun won't touch the edge of the fjord for another 2 hours, and when it does, it will be dim and brief, like a candle through fog. Your breath is visible as you pull the seal-hide curtain aside and crawl into the main room of the house. The floor is packed dirt. The walls are turf-thick, damp, and musty. They hold the wind out. Mostly, the smoke hole above still leaks cold. You stoke the coals in the hearth. The fire never truly dies. Not if you're careful. You add dried dung and a few scraps of driftwood, watching the thin flames coax the chill back toward the door. There is no rush. Your day will not be full, but it will not be idle either. Life here is a rotation of small, slow chores, repeated endlessly, with few visitors and fewer surprises. The sheep need feeding. Their wool will be coarse from the wind, and their bones brittle from a long winter of seaweed and dried hay. You check them gently, speaking no words. Out beyond the animal pen, you chip ice from the barrel near the stream. Water must be carried. The snow is not clean enough to melt without boiling. You gather it anyway. You always do. The others wake in time. A wife, perhaps. Children, if they've survived. They emerge from the sleeping alcoves, rubbing their eyes, pulling their rough tunics tight. A breakfast of sour milk, barley, flatbread, and a thin broth follows. It is not warm, it is not pleasant, but it fills the silence. There is no metal here, save for what was brought from Iceland. Your axe is iron, but dull. You sharpen it slowly, more from habit than effect. Firewood is scarce, and it will not grow here. The stunted willows provide kindling. Everything else must be gathered from the sea driftwood, whalebone, anything that burns. You do not build, you maintain. Repair a boat, patch a roof, scrape lichen from stones to grind into the goat feed, mix with moss, hope it lasts. Your only livestock are small. Sheep, goats, the occasional cow. You do not grow wheat, the soil is too thin. Barley and cabbage might take if the summer is kind. You use seal fat for oil, fish bones for tools, and nothing is ever thrown away. Mail arrives once a year. Sometimes a ship from Iceland, bearing news, and perhaps a new bishop. You write no letters. There is no one to send them to. But you do send ivory, if you have it walrus tusks, carved and wrapped and marked, with the sign of your farmstead. Maybe they'll trade for iron, or wool, or grain. You haven't seen a foreign face in years. The Inuit pass through sometimes, and you trade what little you can. Dried fish, needles, sinew cord. They are quiet. So are you. The church is small, but you tend it, faith remains. If only because it fills the long winters with ritual. You pray for sun, for warmth, for the ship to return. You bury the old behind the chapel wall. The ground is frozen much of the year. You dig anyway, and when the chores are done, you sit. Sometimes you carve bone. Sometimes you mend nets. Sometimes you simply listen to the wind, to the sound of the waves beneath the ice. There are no stories you haven't already heard, no feuds to follow, no festivals to plan. There is only snow, the animals, the prayer that the roof will hold through spring. And at night, in that dim, low room of turf and smoke, you wrap yourself in wool and seal hide. Your eyes close, your hands are raw, your bones are tired, and you think, once again, the same thought. We are still here. For now. Now let us sail backward just a little, across rough seas and colder ambitions, to the beginning of the Greenland colony, to a man with a temper, a vision, and a talent for naming ice. His name was Eric Thorvaldsson. History would remember him as Eric the Red Knot for his hair, though that too was fiery but for the bloodshed he left behind. Eric had already been exiled once before he reached Greenland. Born in Norway, raised in Iceland, he made his name through disputes and vengeance. A feud over land, a killing, then another. Eventually, even the harsh edge of Icelandic law had had enough. He was outlawed, banished for 3 years. So Eric sailed west. He followed vague rumors and fishermen's tellers of land beyond the ice, where game was plentiful and pastures green. And when he found it, he did what all bold men do when facing cold stone and hardship. He gave it a better name. Greenland, he called it, a deliberate lie. A marketing strategy in a world without parchment ads. People will be more eager to go there. He is said to have explained, if it has a pleasant name. And he was right. When his exile ended, Eric returned to Iceland not in shame, but with a pitch. He spoke of fertile fields, soft meadows, and a chance to build a new society. A land of opportunity, far from the feud-filled valleys of home. And people followed. Some were second sons, some debtors, some simply restless. A few were believers thinking they'd carve a better life from the stone. Eric led them back west, across the Denmark Strait, to that lonely coast he had claimed. They settled in 2 main places, the eastern settlement and the western settlement. Though both clung to the same narrow band of habitable coastline, the rest of Greenland remained what it always had been, windblown, mountainous, and indifferent. For a time, the colony thrived at least by frontier standards. They built churches, storage houses, and halls. They traded with Iceland, occasionally even with Europe. Ivory from walrus tusks, hides, falcons. In return, they sought iron, timber, tools, but it was always fragile. The climate turned colder. The growing season shorter. Icelandic ships came less frequently, and Eric grew old. He had imagined himself as a new king, a founder of lands. Instead, he became a local chieftain, respected, yes, but tethered. He died sometime in the early 1000s. His grave, if it still exists, is buried beneath layers of frost and forgotten. Later generations would remember him as a pioneer. His son, Leif Erikson, would sail further still to what we now call North America. But even Leif left no colony, no legacy on that distant shore. It was Eric who built something lasting, and yet it lasted only so long. By the late 1300s, the western settlement was gone. By the 1400s, the eastern one followed. No battle, no grand collapse, just silence, empty farms, abandoned churches, graves left untouched, snow drifted and still. Eric the Red had promised Greenland. He had delivered isolation. The past does not always leave a note when it leaves. Sometimes it drifts quietly into absence, and few stories in medieval history fade as gently and as hauntingly as that of the Norse in Greenland. They lived there for centuries. Hundreds of years of births, marriages, slow winters, and careful harvests, and then they vanished. We begin not with myth, but with stone. On the grassy slopes of Greenland's southern archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries began uncovering signs of a world long gone. Not grand ruins, but foundations. A wall here, a buried threshold there. Pieces of turf homes once warm, now sunken into the soil like slumbering animals. And then came the churches. Tiny, beautiful, lonely things. One stands out. Stilvelsea Church. Built of cut stone, likely in the 1300s, its walls remain standing, bare but firm, framed by moss and lichen. The roof is long gone, the pews rotted, but it is still there, the last known document from Greenland's Norse, a wedding held in that church, in the year 1408. After that, nothing. No letters, no tombstones, no records, no survivors arriving in Iceland to say, "We left." Just silence. What happened? Theories abound. Climate is often the first suspect. The so-called Little Ice Age brought colder winters, shorter summers, and sea ice that choked the trade routes. Crops failed more often. Pastures yielded less. The land that had been barely viable in Eric's time became gradually impossible. Isolation deepened the wound. Fewer ships came from Iceland. Europe had shifted focus. Greenland became a forgotten outpost, far, too hard, and too costly to maintain. Trade collapse followed. The walrus ivory market, once valuable, dwindled. Southern Europe had new sources. The Greenlanders were left with little to offer, and no one to offer it to. Soil exhaustion played a role as well. The Norse brought farming techniques suited to Scandinavia, not Greenland. Overgrazing and erosion made the land weaker. Hay yields dropped. Animals starved. Then families. Cultural rigidity may have sealed their fate. The Norse were Christian, European. They built farms and churches, but not kayaks. They fished, but not the way the Inuit did. They saw the native tools and clothing, but largely resisted adopting them. Some archaeologists believe this inflexibility made them less adaptable than the indigenous peoples who lived in the same land and survived. Did they die? Did they leave? Evidence is sparse. There are graves, some marked, some not. Skeletons in wool tunics, bones with signs of malnutrition, No weapons, no signs of violence. Just people who stopped living, one by one, until no one was left to bury the rest. Others may have left quietly, sailed back to Iceland, or even joined the Inuit. But if they did, they left no records. The silence remains total. Today, the ruins stand open to the wind. The turf walls are soft and low. The paths once trodden by calloused feet are overgrown with wild grass, and above them the sky remains unchanged. The same sky under which 1,000 small lives were lived ploughing, praying, carving, waiting, not for fame, not for war, just for the next boat, or the next spring, or the next bowl of milk. We often imagine the past as noise, battles, speeches, thrones, but sometimes the most human stories are told in silence. A cold silence, a slow silence, a silence of empty rooms, full once, then forgotten. Now, let us step inside. Far from the wind-swept stone of Greenland's coast, across the churning sea, another fire burns, a steady one. In a large turf hall in southern Iceland, a chieftain reclines beside a central hearth. The smoke rises lazily toward a vent overhead, and the air filled with the smell of petis warm. Here, life was different. Still hard, still quiet, but warmer, busier, and above all, more connected. The Icelandic elite of the medieval period were landowners, poets, lawmakers. Some had visited Greenland, many had not. To them, it was a distant cousin, a curiosity, a place for missionaries, ivory traders, and stubborn settlers with frostbitten toes and simple goals. Letters arrived from Europe in Iceland's port towns. Ships brought goods, news, rumors of kings and popes and wars, not often but often enough to remember that a wider world existed. For the elite, the longhouse was not just shelter, it was theatre. After dinner barley stew, dried fish, maybe even cheese, a guest might rise to speak. A saga would unfold, epic tales of long-dead ancestors, of honor and vengeance, of Viking raids, heroic deaths, and winter storms survived. The Greenlanders existed in those tales too, but faintly, often as backdrops, side characters. So-and-so, who once wintered in Greenland, a footnote in a larger story. Occasionally, there was concern. In letters preserved from bishops and traders, we find hints of worry. The people in Greenland have grown thin. The church there is empty. The cargo this year was light, but these notes were folded, sent and filed away. No ships were sent to rescue them. No fleet dispatched to bring them home. Just another icy outpost that had perhaps run its course. Back in Iceland, the elite debated law and recited verse. They wrote Grogas, the grey laws, on vellum. They kept genealogies with meticulous pride. They sent their sons to Norway. They worried about land boundaries, not food stores. Their wealth came not from conquest, but from steadiness. Wool, trade, political balance, even poetry, in a way, was capital. And yet, they knew, somewhere, that Greenland was fading. Perhaps a chieftain stood outside one night, wrapped in wool, sipping warmed ale from a carved horn. He looked westward, across the Black Sea. Somewhere beyond that horizon, cousins scratched at frozen fields. Sheep curled together for warmth. A single candle flickered in a stone chapel, and perhaps he simply turned back inside, because the fire was warm, the bed was soft, and the silence of Greenland was far away. And now the sea is quiet. The wind has died down. The turf walls hold steady. The boats are drawn up, overturned, their keels resting on stone. Somewhere behind them, a sheep coughs softly, a candle flickers and goes out, Greenland sleeps. Tonight, you've lived the cold, repetitive life of a forgotten settler. Not a raider or a king, but someone who kept the fire burning when there was little fuel. Someone who milked goats and mended rope and watched the weather more carefully than the stars. You've walked through Eric the Red's lonely ambition. You've stepped over ruins that no longer speak. You've looked back at them from warmth, and in doing so, you've touched a truth that history rarely shouts, that most of it is quiet. It's not carved in stone or sung in battle halls. It's whispered in empty fields, in soft footsteps on snow, in ledger entries, in ruins that tilt gently in the frost, waiting for someone to notice. You may forget the names, you may forget the years, but something lingers. A rhythm, a breath, a patience, because even in the coldest places, even in silence, there were lives being lived, slowly, repetitively, meaningfully. The north of Greenland did not fail, until they could stay no more, and then they were gone, as quietly as they came. Now your eyes grow heavy, your thoughts drift like sea ice. The fire is still glowing, the snow is still falling, and somewhere beyond the reach of history's noise, someone just like you closes the door against the wind. Sleep well, and thank you for drifting through history.